At sunrise, the rancher stepped outside and froze as cold air filled his lungs. Shadows covered the land like a dark tide, and his heart began to shake. Warriors stood silent around his ranch, holding spears that caught the early light. Slow drums echoed like a warning, beating straight into his chest. He remembered the night before when he gave water to a wounded giant Apache woman without knowing who she was. He only saw thirst, pain, and fear in her eyes. Now he wondered if kindness was a mistake. Sweat ran down his face as he waited for the first move. No one spoke. No one attacked. The giant woman finally stepped forward and raised her hand. In that moment, he understood that mercy always returns, but never in the way a man expects, and this morning would decide whether he lived remembered or vanished into legend forever. Alone, the rancher lived alone on dry land where the wind never rested and silence spoke louder than words. His small wooden house stood near Apache territory where most men feared to step. He was poor but proud, earning each meal with tired hands and endless patience. He did not carry hatred in his heart or violence in his soul, because he believed survival was built on honesty, not blood. People in nearby towns barely knew his name, yet they knew his reputation as a man who never caused trouble. Nights were long and cold, filled with memories and unanswered prayers. Loneliness followed him like a shadow, but he accepted it without complaint. Every sunrise was a battle against hunger, fear, and fate. He never imagined that one quiet decision made in kindness would pull him into a story larger than his life and test the true meaning of courage, honor, and mercy. As the sun dropped behind the hills, the wind carried a strange heaviness across the ranch, and the man felt it before he saw anything. He walked toward the old while listening to the creak of the rope when a shadow shifted near the stones and his breath stopped. A woman stood there, taller than any man he had ever seen, her presence filling the space like a storm held back by skin. Her dark hair fell loose, her clothes torn and dusty, and deep wounds marked her arms, yet her eyes burned with fierce awareness. Everyone whispered stories about giants and curses, but in that moment, she did not look angry or cruel, she looked empty. She took one step and collapsed beside the well, the sound of her body hitting earth shaking his bones. Fear screamed at him to run because this land punished foolish mercy, but his feet stayed planted. He saw her chest rise weakly and understood thirst was killing her faster than any weapon. The bucket trembled as he lowered it into the well, every breath heavy with the thought that this choice could end him. When he lifted the water, she stirred slightly, and a low sound escaped her throat, not a threat, but a plea. He knelt slowly, poured water into his hands, and held it to her lips, ready to pull back. Her fingers closed around his wrist with surprising gentleness, and she drank like someone waking from death. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and the world shrank to breath and heartbeat and shared silence. He cleaned her wounds, wrapped them with cloth, and spoke no questions because fear had already said enough. When strength returned, she rose slowly, towering above him, studying his face as if weighing his soul. Without a word, she turned and walked into darkness, leaving only footprints and a silence heavier than before. He stood alone, knowing night had accepted his kindness, but unsure what dawn would demand in return. The stars felt closer as he sat by the door, listening to distant drums that may have been memory. Sleep never came because every sound carried meaning and every shadow promised consequence. He wondered who she truly was and why fate had placed her broken at his well. The fire burned low as he prepared for whatever answer the morning would bring. Somewhere beyond the hills, voices rose and faded like waves, carrying judgment toward his door. He did not regret the water because a man must live with himself before he faces others. Still, fear tightened his chest as he realized mercy, once given, cannot be taken back. With the first pale light, he rose, knowing the story had already moved beyond his control. Whatever came next would prove whether kindness was weakness or the strongest force a man could carry. And he stepped toward dawn, ready to face the cost without running. Because some choices define a life forever. In silence, he waited there. He stayed kneeling as the quiet settled between them, and the night seemed to hold its breath while he reached for clean cloth with steady hands despite the fear pressing behind his ribs. He moved slowly so she would not feel threatened and washed the dirt from her wounds with water drawn again from the well, careful not to cause pain. She did not pull away or speak, and that silence felt heavier than any shout because it carried judgment, curiosity, and something deeper he could not name. He tied the cloth gently around her arm, then offered more water, and she drank without haste, watching his face as if memorizing it. There were no questions because answers would only invite lies or danger, and there were no promises because he had nothing to give except the moment itself. The fire crackled softly nearby, casting light across her features, revealing scars earned through battles he could not imagine, and yet her eyes softened when she saw no fear reflected back at her. He set food within reach and stepped back, giving space without turning his back, a balance learned from years alone. Time moved strangely, as if the world narrowed to breath and flicker and the quiet exchange of trust between strangers. When she finished, she stood, and the height difference reminded him how fragile his life truly was, yet her posture carried restraint, not threat. She studied the land, then the house, then him again, and he sensed a decision forming beyond words. The wind shifted, carrying distant echoes that made his pulse quicken, and he wondered if he had opened a door meant to remain closed. She lifted a hand and rested it briefly over her heart, then lowered it, and that small gesture carried weight, like a vow spoken without sound. Without looking back, she walked toward the dark path between the hills, her steps silent and sure, as if guided by memory older than the ranch itself. He remained where he was long after her shape vanished, listening to night insects resume their song and realizing the air felt different, charged with consequence. Relief tried to settle, but uncertainty pushed it away because kindness rarely ends at the moment it is given. He cleaned the tools, replaced the bucket, and doused the fire, moving through routine to calm his thoughts. Sleep came in fragments, filled with dreams of drums and watchful eyes and land that breathed. Before dawn, he rose and stood at the doorway, feeling the first cold light touch his face and understanding that the water he offered had traveled farther than the well. He accepted that whatever followed would come because he chose compassion when fear demanded refusal. With that truth steadying his spine, he waited, ready to meet the shape of morning, knowing the night had already carried his choice into the world. He closed the door as the last light faded, and the night wrapped the ranch in a tight quiet that pressed against his ears. Sleep refused him, and every small sound sharpened his senses as he sat with his back to the wall, counting breaths to steady his hands. Somewhere beyond the hills, a drum answered another, then another, spreading low and slow through the dark until the rhythm felt like a second heartbeat. He stood and listened, and the floor creaked beneath his weight, sounding too loud for safety. Footsteps seemed to circle just out of sight, not close enough to see, yet near enough to feel, and he imagined eyes measuring the house and the man inside it. He checked the latch, not because it could stop anything, but because motion gave his fear a place to go. The well rope whispered in the breeze, and shadows stretched thin and long across the yard, turning familiar shapes into threats. He thought of the water leaving his hands and wondered if mercy had signed his ending. The drums paused, and the silence that followed felt heavier than thunder, as if the world leaned forward to watch. He prepared himself the way lonely men do, by setting simple things in order, placing tools away, and straightening a chair, because control over small details made the larger unknown bearable. He sat again and remembered the weight of her hand and the calm in her eyes, and that memory fought the fear clawing at his chest. The wind shifted and carried voices too distant to understand, yet close enough to promise arrival, and he accepted that dawn might bring judgment. He did not reach for weapons because he owned none worth the name, and because courage sometimes means choosing how to meet what comes. Hours dragged slow and thin, and his thoughts wandered through past choices that had led him here, through seasons of drought and quiet victories earned by patience. Outside, something moved and stopped, then moved again, testing the edge of light from his window. He held his breath until his lungs burned, and the sound passed, leaving him shaking yet standing. The sky began to pale, and with it the drums returned, softer now, as if the land itself kept time. He stepped onto the porch and felt the cold air steady him while the horizon lifted its first line of gray. The silence before sunrise pressed down harder than any storm because it held every possible future at once. He straightened his shoulders and faced the open ground, ready to accept the cost of kindness without pleading. When the sun finally broke the line of hills, he stood exposed and waiting, knowing whatever came next would arrive in full light. He stepped forward into the growing light, and the world revealed itself in a single breath as figures rose from every edge of the land surrounding the ranch in a wide, unbroken circle. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, perfectly still, their presence calm and absolute, as if the ground itself had chosen them. The morning air carried no shouts, no threats, only a disciplined silence that pressed against his chest until each heartbeat felt loud enough to betray him. He counted rows without meaning to and realized there were hundreds more than fear had prepared him for, and he understood then that escape was never part of this moment. He walked down the steps slowly, keeping his hands visible because dignity felt like the only shield left to him. Spears caught the sun, but none lifted, and that restraint felt more frightening than rage. He stopped in the open yard and waited ready for the end, because endings deserve witnesses. The circle parted, and she emerged from the ranks taller than memory and steadier than stone, her wounds bound clean and her eyes clear with purpose. Each step she took felt measured, as if the morning itself moved with her, and when she stopped a few paces away, the land went quiet. He met her gaze and felt his fear loosen into something heavier and calmer, because this was no ambush but a reckoning. His heart pounded hard enough to shake his breath, yet he did not lower his eyes. Around them, the warriors remained still, disciplined by a law older than the hills, and the silence deepened until even the wind seemed to wait. She lifted her chin and looked at him, not as prey or enemy, but as an equal whose choice had set this path in motion. He sensed that a single word could end him, yet none came, and the waiting stretched long enough to test resolve. The sun climbed higher, warming the dust at his feet, and he felt the strange clarity that arrives when fear exhausts itself. He accepted whatever judgment stood before him because he would not rewrite the past. The woman turned and spoke softly to the circle, and the sound carried authority that needed no volume. At her signal, the warriors lowered their weapons together, not in surrender, but in recognition, and the movement rippled like a held breath released. He stood stunned as the meaning settled, and the weight in his chest shifted from dread to disbelief. She faced him again, and in her eyes he saw respect shaped by action rather than words. The moment felt larger than his life, and yet rooted in the simple act that began it. He understood then that morning had not come to take him, but to reveal what kindness could command when honored by those who truly understood its cost. She spoke at last, and her voice carried across the circle with calm authority, explaining that she was not merely a traveler, but a sacred warrior bound to protect her people and their land. The night had tested her, and thirst had brought her to his well, yet mercy had met her before fear could claim the moment. In their law, a life saved without demand creates a bond that time cannot weaken and debt that cannot be ignored. She said he asked nothing and expected nothing, and that purity of action mattered more than strength. As her words settled, the warriors responded as one, lowering themselves to a knee in the dust, not in submission but in promise. The sound of armor touching earth echoed softly, and the sight struck him deeper than any threat could have done. He felt his breath catch as the meaning took shape, that the ring around his home had changed from danger to shield. The woman lifted her hand, and the kneeling held, and she turned to him again, letting silence finish what words had begun. She told him that from this sunrise forward his land would be watched and his path would be guarded, because honor must be repaid with honor. He tried to speak, but found his voice unsteady and the effort unnecessary because the truth needed no reply. The wind moved through the grass, and the morning felt lighter, as if the ground itself approved. She explained that protection did not mean ownership or control, but respect and distance until called, and the warriors would remember his face and his house. He realized that the fear which kept him awake through the night had been transformed into something steadier and stronger than safety. The warriors remained kneeling until she nodded, and then they rose together, restoring the circle without threat. He stood at the center, changed not by power, but by recognition and the weight of responsibility that followed. She stepped closer and placed a small token in his palm, a mark that meant sanctuary to those who understood its meaning. He closed his fingers around it, feeling the warmth of shared purpose. Without ceremony, the ranks began to withdraw, flowing back toward the hills with the same discipline that brought them. She lingered a moment longer and met his eyes, offering a brief nod that carried gratitude and respect in equal measure. Then she turned and followed her people, leaving the ranch quiet once more. He remained standing as the dust settled and the land returned to its familiar shapes. The morning continued as mornings always do, yet nothing was the same. He understood that revenge had never been the purpose, and that true strength lies in honoring kindness when it appears. The circle was gone, but the promise remained, and with it a new understanding of what a single cup of water can create. He remained where he was as the last figures disappeared into the hills, and the quiet returned with a different weight than before. The land felt larger, and so did his breath as he understood that guardianship is not given by force, but by trust earned through mercy. The loneliness that once pressed against his nights loosened because honor now walked beside him even in silence. He would wake again to simple work and familiar dust, yet every step would carry purpose. No banners marked his home, and no songs followed the morning, but the promise held stronger than noise. He stood alone again, yet no longer small because the land had accepted him as its keeper. A single choice made without witnesses had reshaped his fate and drawn a line he would never cross back over. Kindness had written his name into the soil, and time would remember it quietly forever.